Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be reviewing the books that I read in February. I had the most substantial reading month that I have had in such a long time. I think well over a year. I read 16 books in February. Now, a lot of the books that I read were quite short. I read a lot of books for work as well, which are children's books. Some of them were very quick reads as well. But there were some chunkier full-length novels and non-fiction books and kids' books in the mix. And when I look at the number of pages that I read in February, that is also up. So it's not just a case of I read loads of short books and that inflated the quantity of books. The number of pages that I was reading is also massively up. And I feel like getting through books as quickly as I was, using those shorter reads to kind of give myself a sense of achievement, it gave me this brilliant reading momentum throughout the month, which I'm hoping that I'm carrying into March for the Irish Readathon. 6 of these books are adult fiction, so I'm going to start with those. I read Come and Get It by Kylie Reid. I read Such a Fun Age, her debut novel, a few years ago, and I really loved it. So I was really excited to get around to reading this one. I had pre-ordered it. I also went to an event at Waterstone's Trafalgar Square where I saw Kylie in conversation about this book, and I thought she was absolutely brilliant, and I'm very keen to do more book events for fun this year. I go to a fair amount of book events for work, and I'm just really keen to go to things that aren't work related to find the joy in going to those things again. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. This book is about the unlikely relationship between Millie, who is a residence assistant at an American college, and a professor called Agatha. Agatha starts interviewing the girls in the dorm that Millie is responsible for in order to inform a book that she is writing about art, about weddings. And Agatha's boundaries and the appropriateness of how much information she's getting about these girls' lives descends into chaos as the novel progresses. But in amongst that, we are getting insight to all of the different lives of these college girls. There's a particular focus on kind of their class and financial situation and how that informs how they navigate all of college life, whether that is their academic lives or their personal lives. I loved that observational quality to this book. I loved kind of being the voyeur that Agatha is throughout this book, where you just get to observe these girls' lives and kind of just be eating popcorn as you watch the mayhem and turbulence unfold. I also loved how the author handles dialogue in this book. I thought it was just so conversational and it felt so authentic to how girls of that age interact and speak with one another. A couple of things felt quite jarring to me about this book. For instance, I thought there were maybe too many characters, and that's a bit more of a personal preference than a criticism of the actual book. If something has loads and loads of characters, I tend to not keep up with that so well. Again, that's a criticism of myself, not necessarily of the book. And another one that is kind of a criticism of my own just lack of understanding was it took me a really long time to get to grips with Millie's role and what a residence assistant was, and it just felt very different to anything that I'd ever experienced. It painted this portrait of American college life that was just so foreign to me. Overall, I really enjoyed this one, not as much as Such a Fun Age. I think the premise of Such a Fun Age was way more interesting to me than this one was, but I think I will continue to read anything this author writes. So Happy for You by Celia Lasky. This is about the friendship between Robin and Ellie, who have been best friends since they were very young, since they were children. They do have quite different experiences growing up, and certainly as they get older, their lives deviate even further. Ellie has gone down quite a traditional path in terms of her family life, in terms of looking for marriage, and Robin is very anti-weddings, anti-tradition. She moves in very much kind of anti-establishment, very feminist circles. So when Ellie asks her to be her maid of honor, Robin is really reluctant to do this, but she does go along with it for the sake of their friendship. We realize that Ellie is willing to go to very extreme levels of superstition in order to ensure that her wedding is successful. She is so desperate she will do anything to make sure that this marriage succeeds. And throughout the book, we have this very sinister undertone as it moves towards the moment where you realize just how extreme she is willing to go with her actions. I thought that really pacey thriller element of the book was done really well. So I was racing to the end of this book to find out what exactly was going to happen. I mean, the first sentence of this book just sets it up so brilliantly. It says, "If you want to know the story of how my best friend and I ended up trying to kill each other, I should probably start with the night she asked me to be her maid of honor." So you know where you're going to end up in this novel from the outset. And that's a device that I really love in storytelling. I also thought this novel just touched on that really important thing that so often happens as friendships transition from being childhood and adolescent friendships into adult friendships, where you find yourself in just very different places in terms of what you want from your life when compared with the people that you were once so close to. I really love the cover of this as well. The combination of the pink background and the bright yellow font and this burning bouquet, I think, is just a great motif for the novel. Is This It by Hannah Tovey? This book for me was very mid. And there's nothing wrong with a mid book. I like a mid book. Not every book you read needs to be the best thing you've ever read. But for me, this really was the definition of it was fine. I feel kind of misled by the blurb of this book. The blurb suggests that this book is predominantly about the friendship between two women, Ivy and Mia, whose lives have gone in slightly different directions in terms of kind of the trajectory of relationships, careers, kids, etc. Obviously, that is something that I really enjoy reading about, like, so happy for you. So Mia is the one that seems to have it all, and Ivy's life is a little bit more chaotic and directionless. The blurb says that she then decides to write a list that is going to change the course of her life, change that trajectory, get her back on track. And then she meets a guy named Scott who kind of throws everything up in the air. And that stuff does happen in the book. But how I would describe this more is about a young woman in the aftermath of recovering from an engagement breakup, refocusing on herself and going through a journey of becoming a teacher. A lot of this book is about her starting her teaching career. And those elements of the book I personally didn't find that interesting. I'm sure some people would find that really fascinating to read about, but it's just not something that interested me. So a large portion of her journey was something that I wasn't that engaged with. I didn't find Scott that compelling of a love interest, and to be honest, I didn't find any of the characters in this that compelling. I didn't find Ivy that interesting. At no point did I consider not finishing this book though. Like, I was having a good time reading this, but I feel like it was more of a palate cleanser between other books than it was me really loving this and engaging with this. I read a very short book. I read This Is Pleasure by Mary Gateskill. This is a novella. It is less than 100 pages. Obviously, I read something this short in like one session on a Saturday morning. This book is told from the perspective of Quinn and Margot, who have quite an odd, unusual friendship. Quinn is an editor. He is very flirtatious. He pushes the boundaries of acceptable behavior. One of his main driving forces in life is like sensuality, entering into intimate connections with people, whether that is through actions or through conversation. And for a very long time, Margot has treated his behavior with this sense of kind of apathy, ambivalence. She's kind of just ignored it until she can't. And this is a book that shows how she reacts when she can't ignore it anymore, although she does try to ignore it. But it also looks at everything from Quinn's perspective and how he feels about his own actions. And because you're in his head, you can really see how he interprets his own behavior different to how other people around him would interpret his behavior. Despite this novella being less than 100 pages, it does a fantastic job of positioning us in that morally grey, moral ambiguous space. It's a very difficult book. Like, the questions that this is prompting raises a lot of very difficult moral standpoints. I spoke about the list in my previous wrap up. I read that in January, and that was a book that is about putting a lens to moral ambiguity and moral greyness in situations of allegations of sexual wrongdoing, sexual misconduct, etc. And I actually think I got a lot more from this novella on that kind of topic than I did from the list. The list covered loads of other stuff that I thought was absolutely brilliant, but I think this novella's depiction of that aspect of the ambiguity was done a lot more expertly. I've not really heard anyone else talking about this, so if you've read it, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I also read a short story collection in February, and that was Games and Rituals by Katherine Heine. I don't normally get on with short story collections. I normally find that it just means that once I get connected to a group of characters and a story and a narrative, it's almost over. And so I don't really get on with short story collections in that way. And I also struggle with the fact that there's probably going to be some stories that you really enjoy and some that just aren't for you. I think this was one of the best short story collections I've ever read. I didn't lose momentum with it like I normally do with short story collections. And while I didn't absolutely love every single story in this, there were definitely some that engaged me more than others. My overall reading experience of this was just fantastic. One of the uniting themes of this short story collection is relationships, be that romantic ones, friendships, or often familial. But a lot of the relationships depicted in this had a nuance to them that I'd not seen in storytelling before. We were given glimpses into these characters' lives, but I didn't feel unfulfilled by the level of detail or the time we spent with them. There was also this level of mischief throughout a lot of the stories, which I really enjoyed. Like, I think how you would describe a lot of the characters across this collection is kind of like they're up to something. And there was a humor that ran through it as well that I found really appealing. So I'm really glad I picked this one up. My friend Anna gifted this to me a little while ago, and she's nailed it. So I also read a classic in February, and it was one of the shortest classics I have, and it was The 39 Steps by John Buchan. So this is like a murder and pursuit detective espionage book. Generally, I don't find that interesting. Did I read this just so I could tick one of my Penguin English Library books off my reading list? Yes, I did, but it was very short. I read it very quickly. It's about this guy named Richard who returns to his London flat to discover a dead body, and the dead body that he finds is the person that warned him a few days previously of a plot that could bring Britain to the brink of a war. Richard is suspected of this murder, so he flees up to Scotland and has to try and warn the government about what's going on. This was fine. I'm glad I ticked it off my reading list, but I probably won't think about it ever again. Next, I'm going to talk about a book of adult non-fiction, and that is Butts, A Backstory by Heather Radke. This is a book that takes a very close look at the role that butts have played throughout history and kind of pop culture. So it takes us right the way back through history, all the way up to the modern day. I thought it was really appropriate that this book started with the story of Sarah Bartman. I knew quite a lot about Sarah Bartman because I had listened to an episode of the Betwixt the Sheets podcast that was all about her. Her life story is fascinating and heartbreaking and tragic. And I think it was really important to start this book with talking about her, and specifically the role of Black women and how we think about the history of the butt and also its positioning in present day pop culture. The book touches on cultural moments like the song Baby Got Back. It looks at the history of fashion and how that's intersected with this body part, and the role that this body part has played specifically with women, and how it is simultaneously criticized and exploited but also celebrated. I do think there were a few cultural moments of the butt that this didn't really touch on, but I think that's potentially because the cultural moments that I'm thinking of are kind of more known in like British and Irish culture than they potentially would have been from an American perspective. And I do think because this book was focused predominantly on women, I felt like the experiences, particularly of gay men, weren't really acknowledged in this book. So I don't think this book was entirely extensive, but nonetheless, if you are really interested in topics like this, like topics of how the body is understood in society and culture, body image, societal pressures, sexuality, then I would still really recommend reading this. Like, I do think it was really fantastic. I do just think there were some aspects of the history of this subject matter that weren't quite touched on. Next, I have a few young adult books to talk about. So I read You Could Be So Pretty by Holly Bourne. I have read a lot of Holly Bourne's books, both her YA books and her adult fiction books, and I tend to always really enjoy her books. Some of them have been absolute 5 stars for me, but at the very minimum, we're talking like 4 stars. So You Could Be So Pretty is about this culture which, on the surface, you might describe it as a dystopian, but it kind of isn't. Holly is just putting a magnifying glass on a lot of experiences that young women are already going through, particularly in relation to body image and prettiness. So the culture that the young women in this book are growing up in is very focused on women and girls achieving this sense of perfection about their appearance. The society they live in is extraordinarily misogynistic in a very blatant outward way. Many of the men in this society are really horrible. And I think when you're reading this, you do have these moments of, oh my God, this is so awful and dystopian. But actually, it really does just put that magnifying glass to stuff that's already happening. So one of the things that happens in this book is male students in the high school will just blatantly play what they are calling smut. It's pornography. They will just play that in the classroom on a big screen. And that seems like, oh my God, how is this acceptable? But guys are doing that in the back of the classrooms in high schools right now. They were doing it, over 10 years ago when I was in high school. We're focused on two characters mainly, Belle and Joni, who are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum. So Belle is very focused on her appearance. She is very embedded in this society. She's entirely compliant in this regime and a victim of it. Then we have Joni, who is awakened. She sees through all of the smoke and mirrors. She refuses to participate in this regime. And over the course of the novel, we see Joni starting to awaken Belle, to open her eyes to what's really going on around her. And the thing that the girls and women in this society are told is that participating in this is their choice. Putting this much time and effort, focus, money into their appearance is their choice, but it's the illusion of choice. Essentially, this book is like an allegory for the feminist awakening. When someone tells you about feminism and suddenly you realize all of the misogyny that you have faced throughout your life. And things like Belle's intense extreme beauty regime again seem very far-fetched, but actually when you look at the kind of beauty regimes and skincare regimes that young girls are doing younger and younger now, this book is so relevant. For my own personal reading experiences, I found the metaphor a little bit heavy-handed. I found a lot of the points were really hammered home, but I think that's just because, I'm 28. I've gone through my feminist awakening. I think if I was reading this when I was like 15, 16, 17, I would have found this hugely impactful and eye-opening, like I did with Holly Bourne's books when I was reading them at that age. This is brilliant. I feel like in my discussion of this book, I haven't even scratched the surface of it. I also read Girls on the Verge by Sharon Biggs Waller. This was a very quick read. I read it in one evening. It's set in America and it is about what happens when a teenage girl becomes pregnant and no longer wishes to go through with that pregnancy. So she wants to have an abortion, but because of various abortion laws, this isn't straightforward for her. She needs to travel to get an abortion. And it follows her on this kind of road trip journey with her best friend, who does have very kind of Christian conservative views on her best friend getting an abortion. She's very kind of anti it at the beginning of the book. But also this other girl that our main character doesn't know very well, but understands the importance of helping someone in this situation. Throughout the book, we encounter barrier after barrier that this girl is going through in trying to take care of herself. Watching what she has to go through is so frustrating and it makes you angry that the system is set up that way. And it was something that I really connected to as someone that grew up in Ireland. I think this book is really important. I don't know the exact details of kind of how abortion laws work in America, but I am aware that abortion rights are gradually being stripped away in a very, very concerning manner. And that also applies to many other places in the world as well. I read a lot of books on this kind of topic a few years ago on the lead up to repealing the Eighth Amendment in Ireland. It was something that I was hugely passionate about. It was hugely important to me. I was putting lots of time and energy and focus into reading about those kinds of things. And I think in the past couple of years, I have just had to give myself a little bit of respite from those kinds of stories. But reading this one really reminded me that it is so important to continue having conversations about the importance of safe access to abortion. In February, I also read the 5th volume of Heartstopper. I won't talk about this one for too long because I feel like most people who watch this channel have read Heartstopper and watched the 2 seasons of the TV show. But volume 5 picks up where volume 4 left off, and we are carrying on this journey of reveling in the joy and also turbulence of teenage romance between our main characters, Charlie and Nick. This 5th volume is focused on the dynamics when Nick is deciding where he would like to go to university and what that means for his relationship with Charlie. And I thought how that was done, as well as all the other kind of subplots in this volume, was all done really, really nicely. I love Charlie and Nick's relationship. It brings me so much joy. I love that wonderful queer stories are available for teenagers now in this very mainstream way, and reading this was just so wonderful. This series is a series that makes you love. I have 6 books that I read for work, so I'm going to whiz through those very quickly. I read Sisters of Sword and Shadow by Laura Bates. You may know Laura Bates from some of her other YA novels, but also maybe from her adult non-fiction work and being the person behind the everyday sexism movement. I'm a huge Laura Bates fan, so getting to work with her now is such a joy. This historical fantasy is so escapist, and basically what Laura has done is she's taken this idea of what if the Knights of the Round Table were women. So it's a feminist spin on Arthurian legend. There are fight scenes, there is dueling and jousting, and just this group of kick-ass female knights. I loved this. It felt so escapist to me. When I've previously encountered historical fantasy, I found it really frustrating that in many of these societies, the women were still exploited. Like, it's a fantasy book. You could change anything about this world and you continue to have women being exploited. This book is the complete antidote to that. The 2nd book in this series is coming out later this year, and I will definitely be reading that. I read Chaos Theory by Nick Stone. This is another one that I read in, I think, like 1 or 2 sittings. So this is about the relationship between Andy and Shelby. So Shelby has moved to this kind of middle of nowhere town for her last year of high school, and she doesn't really plan on making connections or friendships with anyone. Then we have Andy, who is very lonely and in desperate need of someone to talk to. One evening, he accidentally ends up texting Shelby, and Shelby responds. She's not necessarily sure why she ends up responding, but she feels drawn to this person that is texting her. And as they get to know each other and realize each other's identities and that they kind of know each other, the universe seems to be drawing them closer and closer together, and they build this really lovely, tender relationship. Really, this is a book about grief and mental illness, and I think how the author handled that was really sensitively done. And it's also a story about how amongst all of that kind of chaos, everything that's going around you, growing up, those difficult emotions, they are really beautiful emotions that you can find as well, and you can fall in love. I think this was a really great book. You may know Nick Stone from her book Dear Martin, but she's written a bunch of other really fantastic books, and this one was really great. I read Gold Medal Mysteries, Thief on the Track by Ellie Robinson. This is a middle grade mystery book that is perfect for the kids in your life that are also really into sport. It's about 3 kids that go to a big sporting event and solve the mystery of a missing gold medal. There's also really fantastic breadth of representation in this book in the different characters, but particularly fantastic disability representation as well. Ellie Robinson is a former Paralympian, so she brings that experience to this book. And I think if you have a kid that is really into sport and really into mysteries, this is perfect for them. The Wrong Shoes by Tom Percival is coming out in May, and this is a really important story about growing up in poverty. It is about a young boy named Will, whose family doesn't have a lot of money. They're going through an extremely difficult time, and he literally has the wrong shoes. And that is a stat that is really important when we look at poverty statistics. So if a child literally doesn't have the right shoes on their feet, that can be a real indicator of their financial status and the opportunities that they have in life. I think the author did a fantastic job of telling this story honestly and sensitively. He draws on some of his own experiences growing up, and I think this is such an important book in understanding what children up and down the country are going through. I'm really trying to fly through these reviews now. Also, when I'm talking about workbooks, I can very easily switch into work mode, which is something that I try to avoid doing in these videos. But anyway, I read Diary of a Big Bad Wolf by Ben Miller. This is a very illustrated book from Ben Miller with illustrations from Eliza Paganelli. And in this book, we are taking the story of the Big Bad Wolf and telling it from that villain's perspective in a really humorous way. A lot of Ben Miller's books take kind of fairy tales that you might be familiar with or know about and kind of give them a bit of a twist. But this is, I think, the most kind of direct retelling that he's done. I think the way he gives voice to this big bad wolf character is done in such a funny way. And I love how he spins that story that we know pretty well from traditional fairy tales into something more contemporary and funny. And finally, I read Sophie Henn's Happy Hill's Attack of the Giant Danger Kittens. This is a new graphic novel series for children. If you have someone in your life that has loved things like Bunny versus Monkey or Dogman, I'd really recommend this. It's kind of those books with an element of also like Animal Crossing and like Squishmallows characters. Like the characters really remind me of Squishmallows. It's really bright, really colourful. There's a whole host of characters in these mini stories. Each character has their own kind of funny, zany personality. And even me reading this as an adult reader, I was giggling at so many of the jokes that are in this. It is so funny. So that is it. They are all of the books that I read in February. I feel like I was really whistling through those at the end. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Or let me know what the best book that you read in February was. If you want to let me know you are here but you don't have anything in particular to say, please could you leave me a flower emoji in honor of the bouquet on So Happy For You. That's it for me today. I hope you're doing well and I'll speak to you in my next video.